Hello, welcome back, everyone. I'm Megan Ostler, your registered dietitian with Belle, and today we are talking about two factors that quietly influence almost every outcome that we care about while taking GLP-1 medication: blood sugar regulation, body composition, muscle retention, appetite, GI symptoms, and long-term sustainability. And those two things are sleep and stress. Now, I know these are kind of trendy topics, but these are not just lifestyle fluff. And they're not just Instagram posts, they are biological regulators. And if you're on a GLP-1 medication, this conversation becomes even more important. So today we're going to discuss what sleep deprivation actually does metabolically, how stress physiology works, and how both intersect with GLP medications and GI symptoms, and then what interventions are actually supported by research to help us. But as always, before we dive into today's topic, we're going to start with our wins. If you've been to previous lives, you know that we do this for a few reasons. First, we're going to do this because it activates our prefrontal cortex, gives our brain a little hit of dopamine, and is going to help us improve problem solving and learning and have better outcomes long term. It also improves our self-efficacy, so that knowledge that we can do this, that we can change, that we can improve. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds to jot down your win. I hope that you started collecting these somewhere. If you haven't, let today be the day that you start, and start collecting your wins, ideally daily, but at least weekly when you come join these calls. So here's 20 seconds. All right, I hope you thought of at least one win that you're able to write down. Remember, these can be big, they can be small. Really, we're just collecting proof that we are making progress, that we are showing up for ourselves. So even if your win is just coming to this class today, that is good enough. All right, so back to sleep and stress. We're going to start with sleep. And why does sleep matter for metabolism? So sleep is not just rest, it's metabolic regulation. And short sleep duration, typically defined as less than 6 hours per night, is consistently associated with a few different things. First off, reduced insulin sensitivity, increased hunger signaling, increased cravings at night, poor muscle recovery, poor food decisions, emotional regulation is disrupted. Sorry, the light is changing. I think there's clouds, and so the sun is like blocking it. I'm like noticing it a lot behind the screen that is changing. So sorry if my screen is going dark and then light. Again, it's just the cloudy day. Okay, so in experimental sleep restriction, studies show that there's an increase in ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, a decrease in leptin, which is our satiety hormone, or the hormone that keeps us feeling full, and an increase in preference for energy-dense foods or hyperpalatable foods, or maybe what you might call junk food. So there's also reduced emotional regulation, impaired muscle recovery, and even 1 week of partial sleep deprivation can reduce insulin sensitivity in healthy adults. So this matters. And this matters on a GLP-1 because appetite suppression does not override all biological symptoms. So if your sleep is poor, consistently poor, not just one bad night, but consistently poor, you could still have impaired insulin. You could still have insulin resistance. You might lose more, well, very likely, we'll talk about this in a minute, you're going to lose more muscle than you would otherwise. Your fatigue could be worse. Your symptoms could be worse. Your emotional regulation may be worse, and emotional eating could increase. So I've had clients that are on a GLP-1 medication and their appetite is down, but they're still emotionally eating. And sometimes that can be due to inadequate sleep or stress, which we'll talk about. So the medication helps, but it doesn't eliminate the physiology of sleep debt. There is still going to be consequences if we're not getting enough sleep. So this becomes really relevant for anyone in a calorie deficit. So if you're on a GLP-1 medication and that's causing you to be in a calorie deficit, I know not everybody is, but many are. In sleep restriction studies where participants were placed in a moderate calorie deficit, the group that was sleeping 5.5 hours per night lost a greater proportion of their lean mass or their muscle mass compared to the group sleeping 8.5 hours. So same calories, different sleep, and that led to different body composition outcomes. So we've talked about this before, but when your calorie intake is already lower in a GLP-1, we really want to preserve muscle. We need to protect our muscle, not only for our general health and longevity, but also for our metabolic health in the future if we ever decide to come off the medication. So sleep is going to be part of that equation. Sleep helps preserve muscle in a calorie deficit. And inadequate sleep is going to add to our stress. So let's talk about what stress actually does physiologically. When the brain perceives stress, now keep in mind, this is the perception of stress. It doesn't necessarily have to be stress. If we perceive it as stress, it's stress. The hypothalamus is going to signal the pituitary gland, which signals the adrenal glands, which increases cortisol, catecholamines like epinephrine. And in the short term, this adaptive effect is really helpful. It's really important. Cortisol is going to increase our glucose availability by stimulating the liver to reduce it. So all of a sudden we have a surge of energy, and that's really helpful if we need to respond quickly to a stressor. At the same time, the body is deprioritizing digestion. So blood flow shifts away from the gastrointestinal tract and towards muscle and brain. Again, that's really helpful in a flight or fight situation when we need to think quickly. We need to move quickly. And that shift away from our gastrointestinal tract is why acute stress can sometimes reduce appetite in some people. And acute stress is not harmful. It's the chronic, unbuffered stress with inadequate recovery. That's where we start to see metabolic consequences. So with prolonged stress exposure, we're going to see cortisol rhythms flatten, sleep is going to become fragmented, insulin sensitivity can decline, visceral fat can increase over time. But again, keep in mind that last phrase, over time. This happens gradually and usually alongside other behaviors, not just because cortisol is high for one day. So we're not going to freak out about acute stress. You're going to have bad days, and that's okay. We want to look at patterns and physiology over time. Your body can handle stress, but it needs the recovery to match that stress. So chronic stress and inadequate recovery is going to have consequences. So let's talk about that. Now, we're going to layer in another important element for anyone on a GLP-1, and that's gastrointestinal symptoms. These are the number one complaints that I hear for people on a GLP-1 is things like nausea, constipation, reflux. Because the GLP-1 medication is slowing gastric emptying, it's how they work, right? That can contribute to those things. It can contribute to nausea, early fullness, constipation, reflux. But when we add in stress, we add that another layer on there. Stress also, because it activates the sympathetic nervous system, it can also slow gastric motility. It can also increase gut sensitivity. It can also impair bowel movement, and it can increase the perception of nausea. There's really strong evidence that stress alters that gut-brain axis, and the gut on its own has its own nervous system that communicates with our brain. So when stress is elevated, the gut sensitivity increases. And if we're already having sensitivity due to a medication, that layers on and makes all those symptoms worse. So that means that nausea or fullness or constipation can feel more intense. Even if your gastric emptying hasn't changed that much, in short, stacking stress and medication is just going to amplify things. So sleep deprivation can also alter gut motility, and it also increases stress, further worsening those symptoms. So if we are on a medication that impacts our GI system and we're not sleeping enough and we're overly stressed, we're setting ourselves up to have extreme symptoms with our GLP medication. So if we're having GI symptoms, we don't just look at the medication. We want to also evaluate your sleep, your stress load, and then the other things that we've talked about as well with symptom management, which is things like meal size, protein distribution, fiber, hydration. We have to consider the full system and all the biological inputs that go into that, not just a single variable. If you want a refresher on those other things, the other ways that we manage symptoms. We have more lives on it and additional lessons in the 12-week course. Okay, so we talked about this a lot about preserving muscle in our webinars and in the 12-week course. So again, this is just a quick recap. If we want to preserve and protect our muscle, we need to prioritize all 5 of these: sleep, resistance training, total protein intake, and protein distribution. It's not just about how much in a day, it's also how that protein is spread out. And we need to not be in too large of a calorie deficit. So again, we have deep dived into these in previous lives, and then we have also done more lessons. We go deeper into the 12-week course. So if you want a refresher on any of these, on resistance training or protein or calories and macros, check those sources out. So how much sleep do we actually need? This is probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone. You've probably heard this before, but the strongest data supports 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night for adults. But again, we don't have to aim for perfection here. We just want consistency. If we are consistently below 6 hours, that's where metabolic risk markers begin to rise in population studies. So studies are going to show that a single night of very short sleep, especially less than 4 hours, will have next day implications. We're going to have increased hunger. We're going to have increased cravings. We're going to be fatigued and not working out as much. So you'll feel it if you're not sleeping well for one night, but it doesn't have long-term consequences. Again, we're looking at patterns, not isolated nights. So don't stress over one poor night's sleep. If you have a bad night, the next day, prioritize protein and fiber and high volume, low calorie foods like vegetables to help offset that increased appetite, and then just get to bed the next night. Because again, we're looking at patterns. So how can we actually improve our sleep? I wish I had a secret sauce for you. All of this is pretty boring, but that's what the data supports, is the boring. So morning light is going to anchor that circadian rhythm and help with sleep. Consistent sleep timing stabilizes our sleep hormone rhythms. Resistance training improves sleep quality. Reduced alcohol, especially at night, improves REM sleep. Caffeine cutoffs are going to help with sleep, usually a lot more than sleep supplements. And again, supplements are going to be secondary to behavior consistency. So we want to start with the behaviors. We want to make sure that we have good sleep hygiene, that we have good sleep environments, right? Dark, cold, quiet. And then we want to make sure that our day is supporting sleep with all the things that we just talked about before we do sleep supplements. Now, that being said, if you've done all these things on the side and you are still struggling with sleep, then I would loop in a professional who specializes in sleep, because there could be sleep apnea, anxiety, hormonal shifts like with menopause that need to be addressed. And sometimes medication or supplements will be part of addressing those things. But I would start with these behaviors first and then see. For a lot of my clients that have really terrible sleep, caffeine tends to be the culprit. And once we lower their caffeine intake and we have a really firm, like noon caffeine cutoff time, especially for those who digest caffeine slowly, it tends to help a ton with sleep. So it's probably not what you want to hear because caffeine is so helpful, right? And if we're having stressful days, sometimes it's just like, I need that caffeine, but it really is a huge driver for poor sleep. So I would really look at your caffeine intake, total intake, and then also timing, knowing that caffeine has a half-life of 8 hours. So if you're drinking your last cup of coffee at 2, half of that caffeine is still in your system at 10 p.m. So we really want to think about total caffeine intake and timing to try to ideally not have very much caffeine in our system when it's time to go to bed. All right, so the way I like to visualize our stress and our overall body when it comes to handling stress is like a bucket. I like this because it just simplifies a really complex system. So we're going to imagine that our nervous system is this bucket, and everything that creates stress pours into this bucket. So that's going to include the obvious things like emotional distress, but it's also going to increase the physiological stress. So being in a calorie deficit, not eating enough protein or enough nutrients, having nutrient deficiencies, blood sugar dysregulation, not sleeping enough, training too hard, dehydration, GI discomfort, right? That is stress added to this bucket, and illness. So, especially for people who are in a calorie deficit on a GLP-1, that inadequate energy intake is a form of stress. Now, stress isn't bad. A calorie deficit isn't bad. Hard physical training isn't bad. It's all just inputs. The issue is not just what goes into the bucket. The issue is whether there's enough holes at the bottom to let the water out, right? To let the stress out or to let us recover fully. So the holes in the bottom of the bucket, the recovery, are going to be things like 7+ hours of sleep, adequate protein and nutrient intake, resistance training that builds resilience, consistent meal timing to stabilize blood sugar regulation and glucose, slow breathing or actions to shift into a parasympathetic nervous system, social connection. When recovery matches stress load, then our bucket stays balanced. When load exceeds recovery, especially for too long, the bucket's going to overflow. And what does that overflow look like? It can be kind of subtle. It can be poor sleep, worsening GI symptoms, fatigue, feeling wired but tired, plateaus, irritability. So especially with the GLP-1 medication, because that is already adding stress, it's already changing digestion, potentially increasing symptomology, and then a calorie deficit, which can add to the stress. We want to make sure that our recovery matches stress. So the bucket analogy is going to help us ask better questions. Instead of what's wrong with me? Why do I feel wired but tired? We ask, where is my bucket too full? What is pouring in too much? Or we ask, what are my recovery holes and are they too small? This reframes things, right? So we don't respond by pushing harder. We respond by increasing recovery. And that's how we're going to match our stress and our physiology to avoid overflow or burnout. So thinking about the bucket analogy, when symptoms show up, whether that's, weight plateaus, increased fatigue, GI symptoms, poor sleep, the instinct that I see with a lot of my clients is to escalate. Well, I'll just increase the dose, or I'll cut more calories, or add more cardio. I'll just push harder, right? But if the bucket's already full, adding more input, adding more stress is just going to increase that overflow, right? It's just going to increase that burnout. So instead of reacting immediately, we're going to pause and we're going to reflect on our recovery. Am I sleeping consistent? Am I eating enough protein to protect my muscle? Did my stress load increase? Am I underfueling because my appetite is low? Did I reduce recovery but maintain a training intensity? So if the bucket's full again, the answer is usually not more restriction. It's stabilization. It's increasing your recovery, protecting your sleep, stabilizing your meals, ensuring adequate protein, supporting your muscle. So we're not going to respond emotionally to things like plateaus. We're going to respond physiologically. And often when recovery improves, symptoms improve, and usually without drastic intervention, we can start making progress again. So again, you don't need to empty the bucket. You don't need to eliminate all stress. You don't need to optimize everything in your health. You just need to poke more holes in the bottom of the bucket. You need to increase your recovery. So what is that going to look like this week? Is it going to be getting more sleep? Is it going to be committing to resistance sessions because muscle is going to improve stress resilience, insulin sensitivity, and metabolic stability? Is it going to be setting a caffeine cutoff? If you don't have one of those, I highly recommend it. That alone can drastically improve sleep quality. Is it going to be 5 minutes of slow breathing daily? That's going to help with our parasympathetic tone. Or is it going to be eating consistently to help stabilize blood sugar and reduce physiological stress from blood sugar dysregulation? Remember, the goal isn't intensity, it's just stability. And when recovery improves, then our sleep can improve, our GI symptoms often improve, our energy can stabilize, our plateaus can, feel less threatening, decision-making can improve, and we're going to respond again to physiology with physiology. So that's the strategy. Pick one, be consistent, and let your system adapt. So let's shift into the questions. So each week, I'll be taking a few questions submitted by you and answering them. So if you have a question, please submit it to care@joinbelle.com and it'll be added to the next week's queue. If for some reason I don't get to your question, show up the next week. It'll get to the next, or it'll be added to the next week. So we just have a rolling queue. If you have a question after this, again, email them. Any topic is open. If it's not something that's in my scope of practice, then I will just tell you it's not my scope of practice and refer you to somebody who is specialized in that area. So any questions, welcome. All right. If my appetite is suppressed on a GLP-1, does sleep still affect weight loss? Yes, it's going to affect the quality of the weight loss. So remember, sleep influences multiple systems: insulin, muscle, cortisol, food reward signaling, emotional regulation. And if we are not getting enough sleep, even if our appetite feels low, even if we're losing weight, sleep is still going to influence that body composition, quality, and long-term sustainability. So in other words, we're going to be losing more muscle. We're going to be reducing our metabolic output. I wish we could get around sleep, but we just can't. Inadequate sleep is going to have consequences. Even if you're losing weight, that weight is not going to be the kind of weight you want to be losing. We don't want to be losing muscle. So prioritize sleep, even if you're losing weight. Okay, if I hit a plateau, could stress be blocking fat loss? Indirectly, but keep in mind that stress does not turn off fat loss. There's no mechanism where cortisol alone blocks fat loss entirely. That narrative is really popular online, but it really oversimplifies physiology. So can stress influence fat loss? Yes, because it can impact sleep, which is going to impact recovery and intake. And it also can impact one of the biggest drivers I see with my clients when it comes to weight is NEAT, which is our non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It's a mouthful, so we just call it NEAT. So in studies, NEAT tends to be one of the major factors when it comes to weight regulation. Some people will eat a surplus of calories, like 800, 1,000 calories, and not gain any weight because their NEAT increases. So even though they're not exercising more, they're moving more. They just have more energy and they are actually undoing that surplus by moving more. The opposite is also true. We have some people who are eating in a deficit, sometimes a huge deficit, and they're not losing any weight. And that's because their NEAT has dropped to match. And so they may not realize it. They might still be going to the gym and exercising for 30 minutes, right? But their overall calorie intake has dropped drastically because their NEAT dropped, their non-exercise activity, the steps they're taking, right? The fidgeting, the moving around. And often this is not well perceived by us. We don't notice that our NEAT is dropping all the time and we're just moving less. And stress can impact that. So we can be moving less without realizing it, feeling more fatigued. We're recovering more slowly, right? So we're feeling more sore. We're less likely to move the next day. And then we're also retaining less muscle mass often. And so all of those things can be impacting it. So stress may lead to you moving less, recovering more slowly, and potentially losing more muscle, which is going to which is going to reduce your total energy expenditure. So that doesn't mean that fat loss is blocked. It just means that the system's adapted and stress might be furthering that adaptation. So there's also something called adaptive thermogenesis, and that's where the body becomes slightly more efficient during weight loss. The plateau might not be from stress. It might just be from adaptive thermogenesis. And this is normal physiology. But when someone hits a plateau, we don't want to jump to, it must be stress hormones. Could be stress having an indirect effect, but we want to evaluate the whole system. Is protein intake adequate? Is resistance training consistent? Has sleep declined? Has spontaneous movement or NEAT decreased? Again, that's a huge one. Oftentimes my clients can have some other metric to help them pay attention to their NEAT, whether that's steps outside of exercise or whether it's a watch that's cueing them that they've been too stationary, or whether that's standing up and moving every 30 minutes, not just being more super sedentary. When my clients notice NEAT more, then they're a lot more likely to break a plateau. And then the other question is, has calorie intake dropped too low? So much so that we have reduced NEAT, fatigue, poor muscle recovery, and our expenditure is now meeting our intake. So the last question would obviously also be dose of the medication. Is that appropriate? Do we need to adjust that? So stress can contribute, but it's rarely the sole driver. Just keep in mind that plateaus are really common. We expect those to happen, and it's just data. Most of the time, really small physiological adjustments can restart that progress. But again, look at the whole picture. Consider stress, consider sleep, consider NEAT, and look at all of it. Okay, should I take a supplement for stress or sleep? So most evidence supports behavioral intervention first. So consistent sleep windows, morning exposure, resistance training, caffeine timing, all the things that we talked about. Magnesium can be really helpful if you're deficient when it comes to sleep. However, additional magnesium doesn't always improve sleep when we look at the studies at a population level. Adaptogens and many sleep supplements have mixed evidence. So some people find them helpful, some people don't. But keep in mind that supplement regulation in the US is not great. And so we have to be really careful because testing of those supplements have sometimes found discrepancy in the dosing and ingredients not listed. So if you're taking something like a melatonin, it might have way more or way less melatonin if you're not getting one that's third-party tested. So I would start with the behavioral, and then if you need to, loop in a provider and talk about supplements and medication. Because again, you could be taking all the melatonin, but if you're not addressing sleep apnea, that is going to impact sleep quality. So, yeah, start with behavior, loop in a professional, consider supplements, medication as needed. If you do decide to do a supplement, like adaptogens or melatonin or things like that, I would strongly, strongly suggest third-party tested, make sure they're high quality. And I would also loop in your provider as well to ensure that there's not any nutrient drug interactions or in other words, like herbal drug interactions. A lot of herbal supplements like the adaptogens, ashwagandha, turmeric, those types of things can have interactions with medications. So I would always loop in your provider if you want to start a new supplement. How do I know if stress is worsening my symptoms? Look for the patterns. Do you have increased GI symptoms or sensitivity? Is your sleep being impacted? Are you feeling wired but tired? Are you really irritable? Are you fatigued despite taking tons of caffeine? Or are you needing lots of caffeine to get through the day? Rarely it's one dramatic symptom. It's usually a cumulative signals, right? It's usually all of these things kind of impacting each other. And that's when we want to look at recovery. So again, how are we recovering? And keep in mind that we also want to loop in providers if we're like, no, I'm doing all the recovery things and I am still feeling like this, then it might not be stress, it might be underlining like anxiety or things like that. So loop in mental health professionals as needed to help with this. Okay, a lot of people come into the space thinking that if I just try harder, if I just control more, if I just eliminate my stress, then I can manage my body and everything will be perfect. But your body is not looking for control, it's just looking for safety and stability. And sleep and stress are, they're not moral categories, they're just biological inputs. So some weeks your buckets are going to be fuller. That's just going to happen. Travel, deadlines, kids, illness, hormone shifts, busy seasons. Nothing's wrong when that happens. You don't have to eliminate stress. We just need enough recovery to match your load. So consider your bucket, consider your load. What can you do to help match those? What can you do to help increase recovery to match your stress load? And if you're having a week that is extra stressful, maybe we need to build in extra recovery. All right, thank you guys so much for joining me today. We are right at 11:30, so perfect timing. Come back next week as we discuss the new topic. And again, if you have more questions, please submit them. Often your questions, if I get a lot in the same category, will help to spark what we want to discuss. So like, okay, lots of people have questions about that. Let's have a lesson about it. So no questions off limits. Please send them in. We'll talk soon. Thanks.